Well, welcome. I want to save William enough time, so we're going to go ahead and start as soon as possible here. Technology. Okay. Linda's back there. Thank you, Linda, for the snacks. And Louise brought some snacks as well. Thank you. What'd you bring, Louise? I hadn't seen it yet. Banana cake. Okay. All right. So please help yourselves. And again, Steve and I really appreciate everybody's been so good about bringing snacks and all. So thank you very much. Kind of gives a more of a homey feel, huh? To have some good things. You guys aren't just picking up, odds and ends. I mean, it looks like great stuff there. So thank you so much. Anybody here for the first time? I know it sounds like an odd question, but I still get people that'll say, "Oh, I just heard about it. Can we still come?" And we always say, "Sure." It's not like you missed something. It's a different item every week. So if you know somebody who might want to come, it's never too late. So we hope you could invite some other people. Just curious about any apologetics during the week. I was talking to Rick, where do you go? Okay, there's Rick. Can you just mention that thing about Isaiah? That's pretty interesting.
There was I'm talking in Biblical Archaeological Review, which was recommended a magazine. I just started subscribing to it. One of the issues about 2 months back, was about finding seals, one for Hezekiah and one for Isaiah, was it? And it was in a trash pit just outside of Jerusalem. And it's the first time they'd found those two people together, and it's the first time they've pretty much proven that both of them existed as the Bible said they did. And then the other one was about Masada, when a storm that went through Masada right when we were here. We were there at the same time the storm came through and had some pictures of it. And then this one just came today. It mentions that they think they found a basilica for the Church of Nicaea. It's just south of Constantinople, and it's offshore. They've got an aerial picture in shallow water that shows the basilica, and they've recovered some skeletons and some coins and some things. They're pretty sure that's the Nicene church.
My eyes popped open because I had never heard that they had found anything yet that indicated Isaiah had lived, and now they found that. Years ago, they came across one of these little seals from Jeremiah and Baruch, who was his scribe, and there's even a fingerprint or thumbprint on one of the little pieces of clay they've got, and I thought, wow, that's probably a biblical person's thumbprint on there. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. So I always feel so sorry for these biblical critics. They have to keep backing up. One time there's no such thing as the Hittites. Well, there's the Hittite Empire. Okay, well, this no Pilate. All right, well, then now we got inscriptions, Pontius Pilate, and it goes on. Now we got references to David. We've got references to all sorts of things, and it's just amazing what's going on. That's actually kind of a good introduction, because I want to do some time on the reliability of the Old Testament. People spend a lot of time on the reliability of the New Testament, but there are a lot of things. Obviously, it's further back, more things get lost, but there's some really interesting stuff that tie in with the Old Testament as well. I was just curious to see what your comments would be on this. Steve mentioned it, I think, last week, but he and I have been, and that's why he's not here tonight, we've been tag teaming going up to this church in Fallbrook. And so I was up there last week. That's where Steve is this week, and that's the end of it. That's 4 weeks. They are so excited about it. They said, let's do another series. Let's do another series. I said, okay. So trying to get it on a different night than Thursday, so that makes it kind of tough, but we'll see. But this is a church that has about 90 to 100 people, because I said, well, how big's the church? Oh, 90 to 100. Well, they got, what was it, the first 65 the first night. That'd be like Emanuel Faith. We have 4,000 people jamming in here or something, they're getting over half their people to show up. And so there's a real hunger for it. And so it's been a lot of fun. Well, anyway, when I was up there last week, we were talking about reasons we can believe that there's a God. And we talked about the creation of the universe. It came from somewhere, and something had to get the thing going. So if there's a big bang, there's a big banger, as Greg Kokel says. So anyway, somebody waved at me, and I said, yeah. And so here came the question, and I don't know if you've heard it yet, but it's out there. And I just thought, well, why don't we kick it around for just a second? This person said, well, okay, so God, I don't think he's being sarcastic or hypercritical. He's just trying to kind of work it out. He said, well, if God created the universe, where do you think the rest of the sentence went? Who created God? So that's my question. I'd like to hear what you think. How would you answer something like that, Larry?
I would say that God had always been, and I would say that God has always been, and that was what I was taught. The universe had always been when I was growing up. So it's kind of a switch now. They don't want to believe that there was a supreme being that has always been, but that's what I was taught before the Big Bang. Oh, it's always been there. Universe has always been there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, what you're talking about are two different kinds of beings. Anything that comes into existence needs a cause, but by definition, God is has not been created. He's not come into existence, and the only reason something is here instead of nothing is something outside of this universe had to bring it into existence, and that thing is an eternal being. And there you go. You're back to God. I said also to the class that, well, okay, let's say something created God. Then who created that something that created God? And you got this infinite regress. It's I think Aristotle was one that talked about first cause. There's got to be some place that the unmoved mover. You got to start somewhere, or you never get to here. And so there's something else that you can say to that, in case it comes up. I sent you out. I hope. Did you see the article? It was Jim Wallace's article, and I thought it was a really great article. It was short. If you didn't get it, remind me, and I'll send it out again, or send it to you in particular. But he was saying that there's no office in the church for apologetics. And he says, just like there's no office in the church for prayer. Everybody's supposed to pray. And you get that passage in 1 Peter that says everybody's supposed to be an apologist. So my question to you was, why do you think many Christians are either oblivious to it, or they're not interested in it, or for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be a high priority item for a lot of Christians. And yet it's a definite command in the Bible. Peter says you're all supposed to do it. So I was just curious. Did you have any thoughts on that? Why do we end up not being as good at it as we ought to be? Eric, wait, hang on just a second. We're getting a mic to you.
Then I'll put my hand down. I think part of it would be that most of us have grown up assuming that you're dealing with the truth, so why would you bother to defend it? It would be like if 50 years from now people start saying, well, you're going to have to defend the fact that the earth is round. You're just kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, we know this, we've got good evidence, why bother studying astronomy or geometry? Why bother doing all these proofs that the earth is round? We just have gotten to the point, well, it's kind of obvious, so why are we putting all this effort into it?
But you know what that sounds like then? We have become kind of a Christian circle that talk to each other, and we don't realize that outside that Christian circle, other people don't see it that way. And they say, you believe what? And I think it's starting to hit us finally of how serious the rest of the world is on rejecting Christianity. And so, maybe that'll change. I'm hoping it's changing. You remember when the Da Vinci Code came out, the book? Some Christians walked away from the faith, but you know what I was really proud of? A lot of good Christian scholars said, we're tackling this head on, and they put out book after book, and they put out DVDs, and they spoke all over the place. We had somebody come here and speak. And so I think Eric's right. I think we get real comfortable in our Christian thing, go to Sunday and see each other, and we all say, oh, doesn't everybody believe this way? No, unfortunately. Any other reasons you can think of? Yeah.
My thinking is that a lot of us by nature are not very confrontational, and that we don't like the idea of having to argue with someone. And if we're going to be doing apologetics, there's a difference between arguing, I think, and persuading someone. And you can persuade people by asking them questions and put them on the defensive. Well, that's an interesting point. Why do you say that? Help me understand that. And that is inviting them to do it. And they have to take ownership then of what they're saying. And it's amazing how that puts them on the defensive, and suddenly you're not having to do it, they're having to do it. So I think by nature, though, we are people who don't enjoy, particularly with strangers, confronting them or engaging with them. And then we can lose friends over it, too. I think of a lot of us, Mary Ann, my wife here, on a different issue. It wasn't religious-based, but it's value-based. And it's the same thing where you differ on it to the point that you can't have a reasonable civil dialogue with someone because they want to personalize it, and it's not really, you're no longer talking about the issue, you're talking about people.
I think also that there are some misconceptions like you were getting into, that when you talk to somebody, it doesn't have to be confrontational. It doesn't have to be with neck muscles bulging and spit flying and finger pointing. I mean, we're getting a conversation going, and sometimes it's through asking questions. Steve and I have been talking about that for years, that you ask them, what do you mean by that, and how'd you come to that conclusion? Those are the two Greg Koukl questions. And by the way, I'll push it one more time. A really good book, thin book to get started on this, if you're still a little hesitant, it's called Tactics by Greg Koukl. It's such a good book, and you read it and you go, well, that's obvious. Yeah, now it's obvious, but all great thoughts end up being obvious after they're first thought of. But this book is excellent. It's just a terrific book, and it's a way to engage without being obnoxious and without getting arguments going. And the first two sections have to do with those two questions. And so you're right, just talking to people and finding out what they believe and why they believe it. I'll tell you one other thing I can think of maybe that causes some problems as far as Christians getting involved. It's the fact that churches are so busy running 1,000 different programs, and they're all good, but apologetics just kind of gets dropped off the edge. That's why I've been so grateful for Emanuel Faith, because over and over again, Scott Smith is our pastor that's over the apologetics, and he's always saying, what can we do? How can we help you? And he's a real encourager. And they give us the web space, and all we do is hand them things we want on that web space. Boom, it's there within a week or two. I mean, they're so helpful. And so I've heard other churches, they'll contact us and they'll say, you're doing what? How'd you get that going? I said, I don't know. The pastors here love it, and they're very supportive. So good for them. But anyway, it's something that we can think about, keeping the fire going and letting other people know about apologetics, because it's not just, here's another misconception. Everybody thinks it's somehow an intellectual issue. You got to wear a tweed jacket with, a pipe and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's for anybody. We're all supposed to do it. And so little kids ought to know something in the area of apologetics, why they believe rather than just what they believe. So you had a question.
If we're doing what Christ said, and that is to spread the gospel, then you almost have to have apologetics, because I was raised in the church and I knew things, but when I met my husband, was like, well, why do you believe that? And where does this come from? And I'm thinking, well, I've always thought it was that. But then I got to thinking about it, and I couldn't really answer effectively. But if you're going to be out witnessing, you will have people asking you.
Why did God create dinosaurs? I saw Titanosaurus last night, the biggest dinosaur ever discovered in Patagonia. And I was just thinking, what is he doing that for? Why did he saber-toothed tigers, the Ice Age? I don't get it. I wonder if somebody out there has a good, maybe he wants us to dig for bones or something. I don't know.
I told Gary, that's Gary, by the way, and so you can talk to him afterwards, because we've got about 30 seconds here. So I said, I don't know, why did God make so many different beetles? He's a creative God, huh? All right. Okay, so I'm skipping over that. Okay, so let me introduce William to you. He came and he's spoken to our class before. Just give you a quick run through, though. Molecular immunologist, I can hardly say it, but BA from UCSD, PhD, University of Illinois, and MA in Christian apologetics. So here's somebody that's got the science and he's got the theology all wrapped up, which we're in such a scientific age. I'm so grateful for somebody like William who can talk the intellectual scientific talk and say, I can be a Christian at the same time. There's no, he's not going to turn his brain off to be a Christian. He's using his brain. He teaches at his church, which is the Chinese Bible church down the way here, Penasquitos. Runs a yearly apologetics conference. Just got finished with one with Alan Schleman. And Alan, he's been in our class before. And then I wanted him, as he comes up here, I wanted him to just explain, you're going to do Mars Hill is it next month?
Yeah, November 2nd.
Okay. Mars Hill is over at North Coast Calvary Chapel. Why did they, two churches that are North Coast Calvary Chapel, it's over in Carlsbad. and they put on this thing called Mars Hill. It's from the Book of Acts, and somebody comes in from the outside, and they've had some big names. So William, congratulations that they invited you over there. And so he's going to present there. It's a very comfortable setting. They got tables and chairs. It's very informal. If you have a chance, I know you'd enjoy hearing him again and supporting him, giving him a little boost as he's talking there. So let me have William come on up. Oh, you got your own. Okay.
Okay. Oh, okay. I can actually hear myself. So thank you so much. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be here. After hearing you guys talk, I feel like I want to say to Gary, can I come here every week as a student? I mean, this is kind of like a dream class for me, because in my church, we don't have I think the people who are interested in apologetics, they do shy toward the more high school and a young college group. And I say, well, it'd be perfect to mix you guys because we are more mature, in our stages of life. But it's so wonderful to see people of all ages really getting interested in this. And it just really gives me a lot of blessing and satisfaction. I'm so glad I did not bring my tweed jacket. After what you said. Okay. And I don't smoke, so there's no pipe. Now, let's just get right into it, shall we? Actually, Gary and I have met under very mysterious circumstances. I think about a year ago, we were trying to put our heads together and say, how did we meet? And we don't have an answer. It's the strangest thing. So one of these days, it'll probably come to us at some point. But I'm so glad to know Gary and Steve. Too bad he's not here. I would like to talk with him again. But I'm so glad to meet them and kind of have this kind of apologetic camaraderie. And I hope that we can have that as well. I've always been interested in science since I was a little kid. And then I became a Christian in high school. And as I look back on my salvation story and I say, the Holy Spirit was really drawing me to him, because I look now and I say the reason why I became a Christian was when I heard the gospel explained to me, my head said, this makes sense. Insofar as we're in deep trouble, no one's good, we all have huge problems, and we can't fix ourselves. That was the one thing that kept ringing in my mind when this junior in high school, I was a sophomore in high school, was sharing the gospel with me. I kept thinking, you're right. We can't fix ourselves. The fix has to come in from the outside. And so when he shared with me who Jesus Christ was, that night, I accepted the Lord pretty much by faith, although I had a ton of other questions. And that came over time. And as I grew as a Christian, I started seeing how we as Christians bear the responsibility really to be able to explain the gospel clearly and to really be able to defend the faith. Now, when we say defend the faith, it does often, as Greg Koukl says many times, sounds very confrontational. But as Bob mentioned, it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the one thing in my Christian life that Greg Koukl and the Stand to Reason ministry has revolutionized the way I see my Christian life, the way I see my Christian life in light of speaking to others, because he made it such that we can use these tools, these skills, to graciously be able to interact in a conversation with anyone and almost about anything. And when you put that in the context of sharing your spiritual convictions with someone, that's a tremendous tool. And then when you learn this, you're going to start wondering, why didn't I use this in evangelism more often? What was I doing before? It gave me quite a bit of confidence. And I've taught a lot of high school students in which we would go over tactics in defending the faith. And I would get these emails through the weeks of young people saying, at our church, all the older people are called uncle. Anyway, he said, Uncle William, this is really great. All he said was, it works. He was in a biology class, and someone said, well, evolution, of course, is true. And he just came back with a very simple question. He said, oh, how did you come to that conclusion? And the person was kind of stymied. And so he said to me that night, it works. And I think one thing that, especially in the area of science, a lot of times science can be kind of an intimidating thing for a lot of people who have not studied it or are not too familiar with it. I hope that I can kind of share with you maybe some basics about it to kind of get you excited. Because not too long ago, Reasons to Believe, that's the ministry of Hugh Ross, they sent me some questions they wanted me to respond to. And it's going to appear in their next ministry letter. One of the questions was, why should Christians be involved in STEM, science, technology, engineering, thank you, math, I'm bad at math, and medicine. And actually, sometimes you'll see 2 M's there. And part of my answer was that, in today's society, the worldview is so dependent and in awe of the scientific method. And if Christians don't have a say in that area, then it's going to be left to those people without, or with, let's say, with a completely different worldview than ours. And I always like to tell my kids in class, I say, worldview is important. Worldview is something you have even though you don't think you have it. It's how you view things. And I always tell them, how you view things affects how you do things. Okay? And so if we don't have a say in STEM, then they're missing out a portion of a worldview that we believe is true. We believe is the better explanation for how the world is. And we have reasons to believe that. And so I think that's why it's so important for us Christians to be involved in STEM, to see what we can do to kind of even the playing field and kind of make our case before others and let people know that, hey, Christians can deal in science and in a meaningful way. One area of science, of course, that is very contentious is the theory of evolution. And this is being taught in schools all the time. The theory that all of life's diversity, complexity, all of the biology arose from completely unguided random events based on chemical and physical laws. Now, one of the earliest parts of evolution, in order to get it started, is called abiogenesis. A, not bio life, no life, and then genesis, life. So it basically means from non-living things, life occurs. And according to the evolutionary thought, this occurred on its own without any guidance, and it evolved into what we call life. So I'm going to present something here. It's a portion of the talk I'm going to give at North Coast Calvary Chapel. But I want to give you this portion, that the part that really struck me, that convinced me that abiogenesis, life coming from non-life by natural means, is a complete folly. Okay. So I titled it, It's About Time. Okay, and you'll see why I titled it that way. Now, this whole evolutionary aspect of life coming from non-life is part of the worldview called naturalism. Naturalism, basically, the most simplest definition I would give it is the belief that all that we see, all the universe, everything in life is based only on matter and energy, physical, chemical laws. There's no supernatural, so it's called naturalism. Now, one thing about naturalism is the flagship of naturalism is evolution. And by that I mean, I think Richard Dawkins said it when he said evolution, or Darwin, finally gave him the intellectual, the intellectual basis, I'm going to kind of paraphrase, for him to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Okay. Prior to Darwin, you would maybe have that belief that there is no God. evolution gave a mechanism to explain and to do away with God. Now, that's why evolution would be the flagship of naturalism. And part of that flagship, the very beginning of it, for it to even leave the dock, is a process called abiogenesis. So what I'm going to show you is, if this cannot happen, evolution cannot even get out of the starting gate. And if that's true, then evolution and naturalists have a big problem to try to overcome. So I want to start with this fellow here. I watched him when I was a kid. Carl Sagan. Back in the 70s, he was the original Cosmos guy. Later on, they recreated Cosmos with Dyson. Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was a kind of a student of Carl Sagan's. But Carl Sagan said this back in the 70s. He said this: the apparatus for the transcription of the genetic code must itself have evolved slowly through billions of years of evolution. And if you ever heard Carl Sagan on TV, he'd always really emphasize the billions, billions, and billions. But this quote really made me think, especially after I started learning more about biological science. So what is he talking about? I'll show you. He's talking about this apparatus. And by apparatus, it's a kind of a biological machine. It transcribes the genetic code, DNA, and he's saying that this apparatus must have evolved slowly, which is the major idea of evolution, that it takes lots of time through billions of years of evolution. So what you've got here is this the big button here? No, it's okay. Oh, the red button, red light. Yeah, okay, makes sense. I'm a scientist. Okay, so what we have here is our two pieces here, these little globby things here that actually come together. This is taking place in the cell. I'll show you in a moment. They come together like a little machine, and this ticker tape here originally came from the DNA sequences. It's a kind of a substitute DNA. It's called messenger RNA. So let's say down here is the nucleus of a cell. The DNA is housed in there, your precious DNA, your blueprint of life. Then it gets transcribed to RNA. The RNA floats out here into the cell. Then it gets kind of fastened into this almost like a sewing machine kind of thing. Okay, that comes together, and there are components that are floating around. They get attracted to the sequence. And according to the sequence, it brings in different amino acids, and they connect up together in chemical reactions that are governed by these globby things here. And as it moves around and moves along, it produces a chain of amino acids, which are proteins. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. So Carl Sagan says that this thing here took billions of years of evolution to form. Okay, so here is the entire cell, an example of a mammalian cell here. And you see these little brown dots here? Each one of those basically is this machine. So this machine here, as complex as this is just these little dots here. They're producing all your proteins. When you're building bone, muscles and tendons, you're building cells, they're building all the proteins for you. Now this cell has what's called a nucleus. Inside here is the DNA. There are membranes here all throughout the cell that are active and dynamic and moving around. These things are called mitochondria. What they do is they generate energy for the cell. There are things where there's packaging areas for manufacturing. As I said, remember, these manufacture proteins. The proteins float over here. They get packaged. They get kind of signed off. They get extra deals put on them, and they're excreted out into the extracellular space. And so this whole complicated thing has very often been well compared to like New York City. Chicago, San Francisco. Well, no, it's not San Francisco. That's too dirty. Um, it's okay. I'm from Oakland, so I can say that. But the complexity of this cell is just amazingly intricate, things that Darwin at his time never knew about. He only thought it was a blob of protoplasm, as they called it. But with the 1940s and 50s and up till now, we've learned so much about the operation of a cell. And Carl Sagan is saying it took billions of years for this to develop, let alone all of these other incredible systems that belong to the cell. So it's a matter of time, okay? So someone says to you, well, evolution is obviously reasonable and true. Why? Because it requires a lot of time. And how old is the Earth according to today's science? Billions of years old. Oh, so it's very reasonable. Lots of time, billions and billions. And here's what you can do. Oh, you can ask, how many? Let's look at this then, because what we're talking about is going from lifeless molecules to single cells, okay? And you saw how complicated those cells were. So now the question is, how much time really is involved? So I'm going to show you a timeline here. This is my favorite part. It took so long to make this animation. But you can do this on a napkin. I've done it before when I was sharing this with someone. You can do this on a napkin at Starbucks. Yes, the napkin has to be a 4x8 piece of plywood, but you can still do it, I tell you. So we're going to begin with the timeline. You ask, so how much time, according to current science, is really available to us? Let's find out what the entire time available is. So we start this with a bang. That was the Big Bang. Cools down. Time is going up from past to present. These numbers here talk about how many billions of years ago we're talking about. So the universe, according to the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe, is about 13.79, actually, 13.79 billion years old. So here we are here today sitting in class, and here's the beginning of the Big Bang. Now within fractions of a second, millionths of a second, things started to happen already. Protons started forming. Cosmic inflation rapidly expanded the universe. Nuclear fusion within the first 3 minutes. Within the first 500,000 years of the Big Bang, we started seeing atoms form. The very simple atoms, hydrogen and helium. They're the lightest elements, and they're also the most abundant right now. Then later on, about this time, 12 billion years ago, stars and galaxies form. And here's where science tells us that with the stars and the exploding supernova that came after it, we started seeing the creation, formation of heavier elements, iron, nickel, things that we see all today. These things were created in here during this time. Now, a good question came up as why the dinosaurs were around. Why this length of time here? I think personally, I will just admit to you, I am an old earther, but I think in God's wisdom, that certain events occurred in order to make the world for us the way it is right now. So I think that's part of God's wisdom of why he created these things. Perhaps science shows us that, gives us the hint that it's possible it was in this kind of order. It is very possible. So this is an interesting thing that happened to me when I started looking at this. If you divided 13.7, now this is where you tell your friend, this is all the time you got available, nothing less, nothing more, okay? And you show them your napkin. You have them take another sip of Starbucks, okay? And then that's all the time that's available. Do you know if you divide this number by 3, you get 4.567. And I looked it up on Wikipedia. That is actually how many billions of years ago the solar system formed. It shocked me because I divided it and it was almost within the digit there. And I said, just simply dividing by 3. That was a weird coincidence to me. I don't know what that means, but it was kind of interesting. So if you actually cut your napkin or marked on your napkin into thirds, now you can say 2/3 of the way over, the solar system forms. Okay? And then the Earth forms. But in the very beginning, the Earth is a molten ball of lava. Okay? No life is possible here. And then as it cools around maybe 4.5 to 4 billion years ago, you got what's called the LHB, the late heavy bombardment. And what was happening to the solar system at that time, according to what scientists say, is that the Earth and other planets were being pummeled by asteroids, debris left over from the beginnings of the solar system. So when that happens, all of this, the Earth becomes more and more molten. Scientists call this a sterilizing effect. Sterilizing, no life. Okay, so that's what's happening all the way up through this time. Now, the earliest form of life, and this is changing now. This is actually, the evidence is now shooting it even farther back. In a couple of papers I read in Nature, one of the preeminent scientific journals, they showed that this 3.9 billion years ago number, which is right there, the very earliest evidence of cellular life, might even be pushed back to 4.1. Really early. Now, we're not talking just little scum on a pond. We're talking about that thing I showed you earlier that looked like New York City, that type of thing, the complexity, that was already formed. And we know this from the rock evidence. We can see in some places in Australia and also Greenland, there are structures called stromatolites. Sorry, I didn't have a picture of that. The next time I'll have one for you. That they're actually fossilized condominiums, houses, that the bacteria had made. So the earliest forms of life were bacteria, and they created these things that lasted past their lifetime, and we're able to look at them and study them. So the earliest amount of life that we can tell is right around 4 billion years ago. Now, here are 2 markers here. This one that you might get, if you know Stephen Meyer's work, the Cambrian explosion. This is a period about 500 million years ago where all of a sudden, and non-Christian scientists even characterize it this way, all of a sudden, as if out of nowhere, life, the major phyla, the major forms of animal life, appeared suddenly. That's a very interesting part. This is a whole talk in itself. And then here, the DEE, the dinosaur extinction event right here. So dinosaurs are right over here, really close to the end there. So that's all the time there is. Now, here's the interesting thing. Here's my whole point. From here on, there's no life possible, right? The Earth hasn't even formed. Galaxies weren't even forming till way back here. So there's no life. So this whole part of the timeline is unavailable if we're talking about the start of life. Okay? Now, here's the other part. On this side, you have to block that out too. Why? Because life already exists. Okay? So what do we have? We're talking about the origin of life itself. How much time? Your friend was saying how billions and billions of years. Carl Sagan said it probably took billions of years just for that little piece of machinery in a cell to form. Okay, what do we have here? A little sliver of geological time. Represents about maybe less than 1 million years, less than 1 million years to maximum maybe 100 million years. Compared to 13.7 billion years, this is nothing. It's faster than a wink of a geological eye. Now, that's where you tell your friend, this is the time allowed to you to explain how life began. Not all of this, only this. That's a huge difference. Now it puts a big problem in his mind, because let's say you take that sliver of time, now we're going to kind of turn it and we're going to put it on its side so we can kind of look at it this way. Now the timeline's going this way. This is the past. This heading toward the present. And this line here is the line where we have the beginning of life. Okay. After that, it was called the Archean epoch. Before that, no life, the Hadean epoch. Hades, very hot. Okay. So what? Now the question you ask your friend is this. So in this sliver of time, what needs to get done? Just like you at work, you say, I've only got this much time to get some work done. How much work can I get done? A lot of times we tell our boss, I don't have enough time. There's no way I'm be able to get that work done. Here's what you need to do, or the person needs to explain. They're prebiotic molecules such as nucleotides, amino acids, lipids that kind of look like this in a schematic style, carbohydrates. Now it's starting to sound like things that we talk about when we're dieting and things like that. Carbohydrates, lipids, macromolecules, big. Macro means big. Big molecules such as DNA, RNA, proteins. These are the things that truly make you who you are, your structure, physical structure. There are membranes that have to keep all of these in place. They have to form. They have metabolic processes. One of the definitions of life is that it's able to exchange and manipulate energy within its environment. If it can't do that, you really don't have a living thing. And one of the earliest things in that timeline that developed was photosynthesis, the ability that we see all these plants doing, turning sunlight energy into sugars, into food. Now, the thing with photosynthesis is it's an incredibly complex orchestra of events that happen. And all of those things need to be developed fully during this very small time. Okay, so we're going to focus a little bit more on RNA, DNA, and proteins as we move on here. Oh, just to show you, I wanted to prove a point. Yes, I did do this at Starbucks. Okay, so you can draw it. Okay. Now, I put this up here not to remind me that I'm hungry, but a lot of times when we think about biology, we think about, oh, yucky stuff, right? That the living thing is just kind of a conglomeration of goo and mess. And that's actually, they look very appetizing, but I didn't want to put the real thing on. But I don't want you to think of biology like just a disorganized mess. I want you to think of it more like this. And in fact, this is rather simple, actually. You know why? This is a GIF I found of some fractals. This is actually quite simple because what you have here is a repetitive, repeating type of thing. It's kind of monotonous. But it does look kind of cool and complex. That's how I put it up here. But the cell is more like, again, like a large city. If your city was in chaos, and I'm sure we can think of a number of them, then you would have a complete mess. It would be completely dysfunctional. And if you're a city, that's not good. If you're a cell, you're dead. Okay. So I want you to think of biology a little more along these lines than the spaghetti example. Now, I want to focus on proteins. Proteins are, they make up your skin, they make up your mouth, the muscles. All of you is basically made of protein. Okay, now what is a protein? Proteins are made of amino acids. Okay, you've probably heard of those before. When you link the amino acids in a particular fashion, and in a particular order, there are things on these that are chemical signposts, kind of like positive and negative charges. Positive and negative attract. Like charges repel. Negative and negative, they repel. Kind of like little magnets. And they're not shown here. I'll show you in a second. But when they're next to each other, it forces it to go into a particular shape. And that shape is dependent on this order. Now that shape now is, this one's called an alpha helix, basically like your phone cord. Oh, Boy, that's an old reference. Nobody has phone cords anymore. Okay. And it goes into a coil. This coil then can also wrap over itself. Here's the coil here. And then it continues to wrap around. All of these are governed by the charges and the type of amino acid there is. Okay. And then sometimes you'll have multiple units of this coming together. And then when you have a particular shape of a protein, you'll have a particular function. That's one of the big things in biology, structure and function. Structure gives function. Now, here's my point on this one. This is a very important point to remember. When you're talking with someone about biology, you can tell them, yeah, physical and chemical laws determine what happens here. Remember? Different charges will make them attract, repel into a particular shape. Okay. So I'm fine with this. Physical and chemical laws can actually cause these to go into particular shapes and particular structures. Okay, that's not any big news there. Now here's the thing: there are no physical or chemical laws that determines the order of the amino acids. These things here, there is no known physical chemical law that says this leucine has to go before the valine, etc. So the order is completely, all the linkages here are exactly the same. How many of you played with Legos? Right? Yeah. All right. All the little pegs and whatnot, they all fit no matter what piece you're talking about. So one time I used to have a big jar, a plastic jar filled with water, and I poured Legos into it. And I shook the jar, and I had it on a little shaking machine like that. No matter how long you shake that thing, you're not going to build, let's say, an X-wing fighter or something like that. Okay, it just doesn't work that way. Some may accidentally come together, but there's nothing to govern the order, and that's the important thing. But the only thing that governs this order is the sequence of DNA. And here's another bonus. Same thing. There's no physical or chemical law that orders the DNA sequence at all. So as Stephen Meyer would say, the only example of information comes from an intelligent source. So the only way to get an actual sequence that actually works is if someone determined what this is. Okay? I'll be fair. I'll say something. How's that also? Okay, we're not there yet. Here's a picture, a family photo of amino acids. These are all 20 of the amino acids that are important for your life. And notice, again, they all have different little doodads on them, positive, negative, and they all have little side chains that have different chemical properties. So here's what we usually do when we're talking about protein structure. You want to link up like this, like this little child's toy here. They're all linking up together, and you notice that some of them, all the linkages are the same style, right? You just put them right together. So let's use this as our example. So this amino acid, let's say, stands for this. This one stands for this, and they'll come together, and then so on and so forth. So you have different amino acids possible in coming together in creating this chain. You might get a repeat of this. You might get a repeat of this here, 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 but it's all dependent on the DNA sequence. Okay, and then that's going to then, here's another. I'm just relabeling it now, amino acid AA. And then here's the chain where you see an amino acid here. That's blow up of this little picture. And then if you chain them all together, it makes a really nice string of beads. And notice how it's illustrated. Some of them come together, some of them go apart, and some of them form shapes. Again, the same thing, structure and function. Okay, so I'm going to try this. Again, I'm a biologist at heart, so math is not my forte. Okay, so if those of you who are mathematicians, bear with me. So what are the chances of actually making a protein solely based on random events? Okay, we're going to we want a certain order, but what are the chances of getting that certain order by randomness? Like, we're sitting now in this. Let's say the order you're sitting right now forms a beautiful hemoglobin protein. Your job is to pump oxygen back and forth in blood and things like that. But if you were to say, how did we get to this, formation? Did we do it randomly? If you were all to go out again and say, okay, recess guys, go out, then come back in randomly, you would not be sitting in the same places again. And then you would not be able to function as the hemoglobin you are. So a little bit of quick statistics here. Okay, heads or tails, right? Coin toss. Chances of getting one or the other is 1/2. Okay. Now, what are the chances of getting heads and then heads on the second toss? Okay. It's basically the product of each of these chances. Heads is 1/2. Heads again was also 1/2. So in order to get heads and then heads, the chances are 1 in 4. Okay? How about trying to get heads, tails, heads? Well, again, same rule applies. The chances of heads, tails, heads is 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. So 1 out of 8 chance of getting this particular order. Okay? Now, so we can state a general rule now. The probability of getting X number of events is 1 over 2X. Why do we say that? We start with 1/2. How many possible outcomes are there? 2. So the chances of getting one of those 2 possible outcomes is 1 over the number of outcomes. Okay. And then the rule of multiplying the probabilities by each other. So the probability of X number of events equals 1 over the 2 outcomes to the power of the number of events. Okay. So if I wanted heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tail, 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 it's going to be, that's 9 events there. I counted. Okay. All right. So if you do that, if you follow this formula, then it's 1 over 2 to the 9th power. So in order to get this combination, you'd have to at least go through 1 to 512 samplings or events to do that. Okay, so it's 1 chance in 512. You with me so far? Better than I was when I was looking at this. Okay, now, instead of a coin, let's do a protein. In biology, some of the smallest functional proteins are about 100 amino acids. I'll grant that. It's a nice kind of a round number. That's 100 amino acids. That means you've got 100 events to do. And you've got a choice of 20 amino acids. So these are, instead of 1 and 2 events, you've got 20 events to look at. So the probability of picking out one, unless you had a paper bag and you poured amino acids in there, and then you have picking one out, the probability of picking that one amino acid is 1 out of 20, because there's 20 of them guys in there. A functional protein is one in which the sequence allows it to become a certain shape that allows it to do a function. Let's say an enzyme. Yeah. An enzyme, the best kind of example people love to use is a lock and key. If your protein is the key, and then the lock is something it needs to act on, the key needs to be a particular shape in order for it to do its job. Okay. And so the probability then of getting 2 amino acids is 1 out of 20 events to the second power, 1 out of 4,000. Okay, so now we're looking at the probability of getting 100 amino acids in the proper order. And I'm losing my electronics here. In the proper order. Now that's 1 out of 200 to the 100th power. That represents 100 amino acids, right? 100 amino acids doing here. So that's the probability. Okay. Now that means if you calculate that with a calculator, That means it's 1 chance in 1.3 times 10 to the 130th power. Let me fly through the rest of this, because now it's not just the order. In biology, in biochemistry, there are other things involved. It's kind of like one of those, but wait, there's more. The chances of just forming a peptide bond, yes or no? So it's 1/2. Actually, it's worse than that. It's worse than that. You have 99 bonds then in a 100 amino acid sequence. There are 99 of these that all have 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. So that chance of just forming a peptide bond for 100 comes out to this, 1 chance in 10 to the 29th. Okay, now there's another thing called chirality. If you hold up your hands, you see you have your hands are mirror images of each other, right? In chemistry, it's the same thing. You have molecules that are mirror images of each other. Now, that means they're very different because you can't overlay in the same orientation, palm up, palm up. You can't overlay your hand. I tried this. Okay. It was like 3 hours. My wife was saying, go to bed. You cannot overlay them. Okay. So they're different. And so that means you have 2 different possibilities here. So for 100, you've got now the chances of getting the right mirror image. That's your chance of doing that. So now, what is the total chance, the total probability of all of these happening by randomness? You have to multiply each of those probabilities together. 100 amino acids, whether a peptide bond forms, whether it's the mirror image or the not mirror image, and that calculates out to 1 times 10 to the 290th power, and this is what it looks like. So 1 chance in this humongous number is the probability you will generate a functional protein just by unguided. I think I have a better chance of the lottery. Yeah, exactly. Now here's another biochemistry nerd tidbit. It takes 5 seconds to make a 100 amino acid protein. Those little machines in your cells are really fast. In 5 seconds, it'll put together a string of 100. So if that's how long it takes, then I divided this number by 5. That would be how many times it could make a 100 amino acid protein. And so it would take you this long to go through those combinations. 10 to the 272nd trillion years. Okay. Now, I did this with a high school class. This is kind of fun. It's kind of like a physics thing. We calculated how many seconds have gone by in the age of the universe. 4 times 10 to the 80th. And this is the number of seconds to go through all of these. 10 to the 272nd. So it doesn't even, it boggles the mind. Okay, so there's not even enough time in the entire time that the universe has been around to generate one single protein correctly by just unguided random means. Okay. And this is one of my favorite quotes because it's so simple, but it's so telling. Richard Dickerson, he was head of the department of biochemistry at UCLA, 1978. Even though it was quite some time ago, I think, oh wow, I was in my 2nd year in college, some time ago. It rings true today, and no one has really been able to refute this. It's true. The most striking aspect of the evolution of life on Earth, or at least the origin of life, is that it happens so fast. Some people say it seems as though as soon as the Earth was ready for life, life appeared. Francis Crick, one of the 2 gentlemen, Watson and Crick, who discovered the structure of DNA. They didn't discover DNA. That was actually even before them. But they discovered the structure of DNA, which was the whole key to the biology. They said, Francis Crick said, the amount of and number of things that had to occur at the same time, and he's an atheist, mind you, is so improbable it would have to have been a miracle for this to occur. Does he believe in miracles? Absolutely not. But I think what he says still rings very true. So I want to take a moment. That was only one aspect of it. There are a couple of other aspects in this talk, but I don't have time to share with you. But I want to stop here and say what my argument is not. My argument, and please take note of this. My argument is not, oh my goodness, this is so awesomely complex. We don't know how it happened, therefore God. That is not my argument. That is what people refer to disparagingly as the God of the gaps argument. They say, you Christians, you just say, you don't know how these things happened, so you bring God into it. I do a Skype every now and then with RB High School. They have a Christian club there, and they invite friends or non-Christians. And we got into this talk. The young man was saying, well, you're just being lazy and just saying God did it. I said, well, I wouldn't call it lazy, but I said, well, do you have an explanation? And he said, no, but one day we will know. And I said to him, well, thank you for sharing your faith statement with me. Okay. Because if you're going to play that game, then who has more reasons? If a supernatural creator designer seems to fit as a good explanation of the facts, why am I not justified in using that then? I'm justified in that as an explanation. And then I would emphasize that that's why Christianity is the best explanation for the way things are. Change my mind. Come on, that kind of thing. So that my argument is not that it's amazing. I'll save that for later. We can then come together, sing songs, and say, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Absolutely. But when I'm talking to a non-believer, I said, this is not my argument. Okay. I drew this in 2014. Okay. So what you want to tell these people is that, hey, if you're really thinking that this is all going to come about by naturalistic means, don't hold your breath. And if they really believe that, continue to ask them, give me a mechanism. This is what science is all about. Science is all about show me how. Give me a reasonable mechanism of how this came about. So when we're talking about the flagship of naturalism, I think evolution has some fundamental difficulties in the very beginning. Now, the case for Christianity doesn't hinge just on this particular thing. The wonderful thing I praise God for is that the case for Christianity is a cumulative case. We can make a case from Abiogeneses. We can make a case from the lack of fossil intermediates. We can make a case for there's another wonderful area where just waiting for the right mutations. I read two papers. No, I lied. I read one paper. The other one, I saw the title. I read one paper where this it was just an academic paper. They were estimating how long it would take for just two useful mutations to occur in a pre-humanoid hypothetical population. They loaded it into a program that they wrote. Now, people will say very often, oh, programs, they're not very reflective of reality. It depends on the program. You'd have to say, well, let's look at what parameters they actually studied. The nice thing was they went to great pains to stack the deck in favor of evolution. Everything was almost like they went tenfold, 100-fold more. And then the result was to get two good mutations to result in a meaningful change. Just two. The waiting time, they calculated, was 10 billion years. Now, that's just for a pre-hominid population, and then notice they were very careful to talk about populations rather than just one or two creatures. Take that idea and go through all the species that you can think of. They had to then, according to evolution, all have achieved more than two mutations. Mutation upon mutation upon mutation And if that program is even a little bit right, then you have to ask, how did this happen? How did this happen? And give me a reasonable response, somebody, that kind of thing. So again, without abiogenesis, the beginning of life, evolution doesn't even get out of the starting gate. So if people are saying evolution is true, and then you have reasons that the origin of life is so incredibly difficult to reason out, then how can evolution be true? I really could kick myself. I just found out last year, 2017, in San Diego, they had the Symposium of the Origin of Life researchers gathering. Because I know Fazrana, he went to one about maybe in 2014. So I said, if one comes to town, I'm going. I missed it. But again, in a 2011 symposium, the conclusion was that there was really no way to know how the genetic code originated, how life originated. They're very good scientists, I must say. I really love reading their work. I respect them a lot. Yet they also themselves understand that this is a tough nut to crack. And they haven't cracked it, haven't even begun to scratch the surface. So that's what I want to share with you today. So naturalism fails. Theism, a creator-designer, is a better explanation for the origin of life as we know it. And that's all I have for you today. So I appreciate you listening. And take questions. I like the Velcro.
Well, let me just mention a couple things here. Tracy has some books over there. Do you want to let people know what's going on with them?
Right. Remember, if you were here last week, remember we talked a little bit about Hugh Ross's book, Improbable Planet, and I brought some extra copies. And so if you were not here last week and wanted to pick up a copy, we've got extras on the table over there.
And I took thorough notes tonight, so in case you were trying to keep up with that, so what I'll do is I'll type it up and I'll get it out to everybody, okay? And we have some books over there by the water, so help yourselves. And I'm guessing that I can pretty well know what he's going to say here, but I bet William doesn't buy into the theistic evolution idea.
I do not.
A lot of Christian colleges are starting to head toward theistic evolution, which means we'll buy into evolution, but we'll just say God did it, so that we can kind of make all the Christian parents happy. Well, they're on that boat that's heading down, as he showed there. I mean, what a time to get on the boat. This is the worst time possible. I could see them doing it 100 years ago. But do you have any thoughts about theistic evolution?
Yeah. I hate to sound, I'm going to be disparaging here. I mean, talk about lazy. I think that's a lazy conclusion. Okay. Because now you're trying to have it both ways. You're trying to say God exists and he used evolution to bring about life on earth. At one point in my young life, I said, that sounds really good. It seems to help me with my balance between science and my faith. But then I think Greg Koukl said it very well. It's kind of an oxymoron. It is an oxymoron. So God intentionally used completely random processes to design life. If evolution by definition is an unguided, random process, then how can that be used to design something by a designer? It doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. And then the other side is theologically, we have some huge problems with that.
Yeah, most of the theistic evolutionists, for example, don't believe that there was an Adam and Eve.
Right.
And so when you get to Paul saying that Jesus is like the second Adam, it's like, why is Jesus talking about Adam if he didn't really exist? So there's a lot of deep swamp that you're getting into if you're getting into theistic evolution. Yeah. So the only reason I mention that is I bet some of your grandkids or friends or whatever are thinking about colleges or going to colleges. Check what's going on in the biology department in those schools, because some of the real well-known classy schools, and I can't remember names, so I don't want to say anything wrong, but some are buying into this theistic evolution.
BioLogos is located here in San Diego.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, Biologos is the kind of the preeminent theistic evolution organization, and they're headquartered at Point Loma Nazarene.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, there's a great book by Francis Collins. He's the head of the Human Genome Project, and it's called The Language of God. And it's a wonderful read, but about 3/4 in there, you begin to discover this business about theistic evolution.
Yeah.
And he's made predictions that are already wrong, because he said, from a theistic evolution perspective, you've got a lot of genetic junk inside of you because there are a lot of dead ends when all these random processes took place. And so he said, yeah, junk DNA is proof that there was evolution. And of course, William knows that they're finding all sorts of use for that quote unquote junk DNA. It's not junk. They're finding all sorts of things that it does. So even Francis Collins had to back off from that one and say, well, yeah, Matthew? Wait, let's get a mic over there.
Thank you. The class that I took in Palomar, the professor stated that she didn't really see why theism and evolution couldn't exist together.
Okay. I would say I would bring it back to the actual definition of evolution. If you look in school books too, they say it's a unguided random process. Okay. So for a creator God to put everything in the hands of randomness, I don't see how that works. It's just contradictory. Yeah.
Questions over here?
We're just going to play devil's advocate.
Okay.
Theological implications aside, which I agree, I think are the showstoppers, but if you were to take a slightly different definition of evolution, because I've also heard people say, well, change over time,
Right.
that's all it is.
Right.
Well, couldn't God have guided those changes? And so couldn't God have arranged those amino acids and eventually he created those proteins and things like that?
I'll go out on a bit of a limb. Because as soon as you get away from what I think is a pretty solid definition of evolution, let's say God did say, okay, I'm going to intervene here. I'm going to put that leucine next to the valine or something like that. I'm going to design this protein just this way. And then let's see how it goes. Or something like that. Well, of course, he knows how it goes because he's all-knowing. But then it's no longer evolution to me. Even that, it's no longer evolution. You'd have to redefine it. Yeah, yeah. Some people call it punctuated. Oh, no. There's another one. Punctuated, I'm getting old. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould, and he had his associate. Anyway, but I'm not talking about punctuated equilibrium. It was kind of like when God intervenes at certain specific points, long time. I'll go out on a limb. I say it's possible that he could do that. I think human beings, though, was the pinnacle of creation. I think they were specially created. Yeah. But we do see processes of mutations. It's just that they're never good enough to create anything. Yeah.
And the problem is this is like a flying spaghetti monster. I mean, it's like if God's behind the curtain doing all these things, he's an extra. You don't really need him. I mean, you've got these processes going on, you're just adding another level of complexity. You don't really need that at all. If all this stuff is going on anyway, but he's manipulating it, you don't need him because it's going on. It's happening anyway. So he's just an added fixture by Christians who are desperate to get God in there. It's the God of the gaps thing again. So somebody else had it. Yeah.
So the question I had was, sometimes you hear this confusion between, I think God designed adaptation into our bodies. Adaptation, and you see that in certain animal species. You see that in skin color and hair type and such. And sometimes you hear people, they may confuse evolution with adaptation, and they define evolution as that. And that's not as. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Right. So another way of looking at adaptation is I think people would look at it as natural selection, where you get some that can't survive very well and then they die off. And then over time you seem to see a kind of a different characteristics that come more to the forefront of a particular population. I'm fine with that, but then where has that ever had enough creative power to actually create a new type of limb or a wing from a fin, that type of thing? I don't think we've ever had that kind of observation before. This is what people frequently call microevolution, something like that. I mean, I'm okay with that. There are changes. Natural selection that is observed. Mutations are observed, but neither of those have anywhere near the creative power to show and explain the diversity of life on Earth.
There's a really terrific series of films put out by Illustra Media, and you probably heard us talk about that before. The oldest one is called Unlocking the Mystery of Life. You can go on YouTube, and you can see the very thing that William's been talking about tonight, how the DNA is used as a blueprint to form these new proteins. It shows you how they're folded, and it's computerized. It's really well done. But I just saw Illustra's putting out every Christmas. They sell their DVDs super, super cheap. If you're interested, let me know, or I'll just send a note out to everybody, because you can get these things almost like, distributing them like candy, especially with Halloween coming and Christmas. You can give them to anybody, too. They're not offensive. Nobody's going to say, oh, you're ramming Christianity down my throat. No, it just shows the design. Yeah. From the small stuff to, they got one on birds, they got one on fish, they got all these things, to whales. They show you all the amazing stuff that has to happen to get the animal to be able to do what it's doing.
Yeah, especially a lot of these molecular models and computer animation. I can tell you for a fact they're based on exact and precise measurements. When they show this one protein kind of walking along this what's called an actin filament, it looks kind of dorky, but it actually is how they calculated the angles, the trajectory, the speed. They have all calculated, and so it's extremely accurate. Yeah.
It's dynein, dynin. That's the protein. Oh, yeah. And I was just looking at it the other day. It's amazing. It's a little thing. It forms a highway of microtubule highway. Just kind of forms, and then this thing goes walking across. It's carrying some chemical something or other, and it takes
payload.
It some payload, takes it wherever it needs to, and then that micro highway just goes away. It's like, can you imagine I-15, and then they take it away every day, and they put another chunk of asphalt going somewhere else? Like, wow. I mean, we can't do that, and the cell's doing it all the time.
It is incredible, because those are kind of the mechanical things you see inside the cell. And there are many other things that are going on. There's in the past 10 years, they've been now mapping out gene regulatory networks. We think in our high school biology, we have DNA goes to protein, the protein goes to enzymes, blah, 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 blah. But what we now know is that the little pieces of genes called microRNA fragments actually get spewed out throughout the cell, and it actually regulates or slightly nuancing the expression of genes. And we didn't know this before, but now it is so complex, like a web. It truly is a web. Yeah.
We'll just do one more with Michael here, and then we're going to have to break.
So when you talk about the number of micro machines in one cell, your illustration kind of indicated like hundreds, but is it hundreds or thousands?
It's thousands. The one small ribosome pair, I kind of think of it as R2-D2 inside the Death Star. That kind of size differential. And all the mechanisms going on are not only going on simultaneously, but in precise timing too. It's incredible. If you were to build the Empire State Building, and then all of a sudden the windows came first, or the cement came, 3 days later or something like that. It's a mess. You would never get it built, but the cell has all the timing worked out perfectly. And without that, we would not be alive. And so it's an amazing complexity. It truly is.
Well, we'll stick around for a few minutes, and if you have a further question, and I really appreciate William coming tonight. This is the second time.
I really appreciate being here. Thank you, guys. You guys are great.
Oh, he's terrific, isn't he? I'll close in prayer. Father, we thank you for people like William who are using their brains, their minds for you, and seeing no disconnect between science and Christianity. And we thank you for this amazing world that you've designed. And the more we find out, the closer we get to the making the case for Christianity. Science is leading us toward you, not away from you. So we thank you for that. And thank you for the people coming out tonight. And I pray that this was an encouragement for everybody's faith, and pray this in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah. What day, William, what date are you, what date are you speaking at the Mars Hill?
November 2nd.
November 2nd. Okay.
I'm going to add on to it some mechanisms of how people think life began and kind of